There was something written in the dust. Not words, not a clear message, just parallel lines on the floor of a childhood bedroom, traced by a force that no one in that house could explain, an impossible geometry that appeared after every storm, after the black wind crossed the fields and left the world covered in a haze that tasted of dead earth. A 10-year-old girl looked at those lines as if they were the language of someone trying to speak to her from the other side. Her father looked at them too, but with a mixture of fascination and fear that he himself could not name. The father's name was Joseph Cooper, and what he was about to discover would change everything he thought he knew about time, love, and our place in the universe. Interstellar, released in 2014 and directed by Christopher Nolan, begins not in the stars, but on the earth, literally on the dirt, cracked soil, crops rotting before they ripen, a world eating itself from the inside out. At some not too distant point in the future, humanity is losing the most important war it has ever fought, and its enemy has no face or name. It is hunger. It is the dust. It is the silent extinction that arrives, not with explosions, but with the gradual whisper of fields that stop producing, one by one, until only corn is left. And even the corn begins to fail. Cooper is not a farmer by choice. He was a NASA test pilot before NASA ceased to exist as the world knew it. He was a man made for the sky, for speed, for the edge of the possible. But the world didn't need explorers. It needed hands that could plant and harvest. So Cooper buried his dreams in the same earth he cultivated, and raised 2 children alongside his father-in-law, Donald, in a farmhouse that creaked with every storm. His daughter's name was Murphy. Murph, she was named after the law that states, whatever can go wrong, will go wrong. Her father had taught her to see that law not as a curse, but as a tool. If you know things can fail, you can anticipate them. Murph was smart with a ferocity that scared her teachers. She was curious with an intensity that got her into trouble at a school that preferred to teach children that the Apollo missions had been a hoax. Expensive propaganda designed to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Cooper was called to the principal's office for insisting to the teacher that the moon landing was real. In a world where humanity needed farmers and not dreamers, even historical truth had become an inconvenient luxury. Then the storm came, one of those dust storms that darkened the sky for days, that slipped under doors and through window cracks, no matter how many wet cloths were laid down as barriers. Cooper and Murph were in her room when the lines appeared on the floor. The dust that had filtered inside didn't fall randomly. It organized itself. Parallel stripes of varying density, a pattern that shouldn't exist, defying the basic physics of how dust falls under gravity. Murph wanted to call it a ghost. Cooper called it by its proper name, a gravitational anomaly. Fascination gnawed at him from the inside. That night, fingers touching the floor, Cooper measured the spaces between the lines. He converted them into numbers. The numbers were coordinates. It wasn't the first time something strange had happened in that room. Books falling off the shelf by themselves. Always the same books, always in the same order. Murph had a theory about a ghost. Cooper had a theory about physics, but neither of them could yet imagine that both theories were, deep down, the exact same thing. The coordinates led them through the darkness of that night, in a pickup truck, not really knowing where they were going, following numbers instead of instinct. What they found at that address had no official name. It was an underground facility, invisible from the air, protected by fences and silence. and inside operated what was left of NASA. Professor John Brand was waiting for them as if he had been waiting his whole life. Calmly, with the gravity of someone carrying a secret so heavy it has already bent his back, Professor Brand explained what the government had hidden from the world 48 years ago. Near Saturn, a wormhole had appeared, an opening in the fabric of space-time that shouldn't exist but did, connecting this solar system to another in another galaxy, where 12 potentially habitable planets orbited a massive black hole they called Gargantua. Humanity had sent 12 astronauts before, one for each planet, as part of the Lazarus Project. 3 of them had transmitted positive signals. 3 worlds that could be the human race's next home. And time was running out. The dust in Murph's room hadn't been random, and the coordinates the lines had traced hadn't led Cooper to that place by accident. What no one told him yet, what Professor Brand kept to himself with the delicacy of a man who knows the weight of truths revealed too soon, was that there was something else. A problem in the equation, a missing variable, a lie buried at the heart of the entire mission. But that would come later. Cooper didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Professor John Brand's words bounced inside his chest like a living thing, as if the knowledge of what lay beneath that facility had changed the density of the air he breathed. A wormhole near Saturn. 12 planets. The end of the Earth not as a metaphor but as a scientific, measurable, inevitable fact. And somewhere in that equation, his name. Brand hadn't asked him if he wanted to go. He had presented it as if the question were a formality, as if the universe had already made the decision and Cooper only needed to catch up. They needed the best pilot they had left. And Cooper was, without a doubt, the best pilot they had left. Interstellar builds its deepest heartbreak not in outer space but in a farmhouse kitchen. In the most difficult conversation Cooper would have in his entire life. Murph, having discovered her father was leaving, locked herself in her room. She didn't come down for dinner. When Cooper went up to get her, he found her sitting on the floor, her back against the bed, staring at the dust lines no one had wiped away yet, as if in them she could find the reason for his betrayal. "Don't go," she said, just like that. Unadorned, Cooper knelt in front of his daughter. He explained what he could explain, that humanity needed a new home, that if someone didn't go, there would be no future for either of them, that he promised to come back. The promises of departing fathers are the most fragile in the world, built with the best intentions and the most terrible uncertainty. And Murph knew this even if she didn't have the words to name it. She was 10 years old and already understood that a promise made against the physics of the universe isn't worth the same as a promise made in a home kitchen. He left her his watch, an analog, solid wristwatch. He told her to keep it, that when he returned, they could compare their 2 watches and see how much time had passed for each of them. It was science. It was also the only way he found to leave her something tangible, something beating at the same rhythm as him, even if he were light years away. Murph didn't come out to say goodbye. Cooper carried that the way one carries, a wound that doesn't bleed outwardly, pushing that pain down to a place inside himself where it couldn't paralyze his hands or cloud his judgment, and boarded the endurance with the trained coldness of someone who learned to separate the heart from the control sticks. But deep down, in that place where the coldness doesn't reach, the sound of his daughter's footsteps failing to come down the stairs would accompany him for years. The crew of the Endurance was small and precise. Dr. Amelia Brand, Professor Brand's daughter, a NASA scientist tasked with evaluating the habitability of the target planets. Doyle, a higher-ranking mission coordinator, methodical and loyal to protocol. Romilly, a physicist specializing in wormholes, capable of spending years in orbit studying phenomena most humans couldn't even imagine. And to robots, TARS and Ks, designed with a geometry that didn't imitate the human form but responded to the pure logic of function. TARS was programmed for 90% honesty, not by limitation but by design. Absolute honesty, as TARS himself would explain with a dryness bordering on humor, isn't the most diplomatic way to communicate with emotional beings. The trip to Saturn took 2 years. 2 years inside a ship that was half submarine, half laboratory, half isolation pod. 2 years during which the Earth kept spinning, the corn kept dying. Tom Cooper kept growing up on a farm without his father, and Murph kept looking at that watch, without moving it from where he had placed it the day he left. Near Saturn, they saw it. The wormhole looked like nothing any human being could have imagined before that moment. It wasn't a tunnel. It wasn't a rectangular portal of blue light like in the sci-fi movies Cooper had watched as a kid. It was a perfect, translucent sphere that distorted the space around it as if reality itself had folded into a single point and someone had pushed their fingers through from the other side to open a window. Inside that sphere, the space of another galaxy was visible as if through curved glass. Stars no one in human history had ever seen before. An alien solar system. Possibility. Cooper took the controls. His hands didn't shake. The Endurance passed through the wormhole, and the universe closed behind them like water closing back over a stone. The first planet on the list was Miller's, named after the Lazarus Project astronaut who had transmitted the positive signal from its surface. It orbited dangerously close to Gargantua, the supermassive black hole whose gravity warped the space-time around it, with a silent violence the instruments could barely measure. And here is the key that changes everything that follows. In the proximity of Gargantua, time does not run at the same rate as in the rest of the universe. 1 hour on the surface of Miller's planet equaled 7 years on Earth. 7 years. For every hour, Cooper knew it. Amelia Brand knew it. Everyone knew it. And yet, Miller's signal was still active, which meant that, in theory, there was something on that planet justifying the cost. What they couldn't know, yet was the exact price they would pay for those few hours. Doyle, Brand, and Cooper descended in the lander toward a surface the instruments described as covered in shallow water. The planet was an endless ocean under a strangely colored sky, with waves forming on the horizon with a deceptive slowness that hid their true scale. The waves weren't small. What they found of Miller's expedition was just wreckage. Twisted metal. No signs of life. The positive signal they had followed, there was an automated echo. A transmission mechanically continuing long after any real hope had been extinguished. Miller was dead. The planet was inhospitable. And then Cooper looked toward the horizon and saw the wall of water, not a wave. A mountain of ocean moving toward them with the inevitability of a physical fact that holds no opinions about who is in its way. Thousands of feet high, silent in the distance, deafening when it arrived. Doyle didn't make it to the module in time. The ocean took Doyle with the same indifference with which the universe performs all its selection operations. Without cruelty. Without intent. Just physics. Cooper and Brand managed to take off with the lander soaked and the engines damaged. When they arrived back at the Endurance, panting, hands still shaking on the controls, Romilly was waiting for them at the airlock. He had an expression Cooper couldn't read at first. It wasn't exactly relief. It was something harder. How much time passed up here? Cooper asked. Ramilly took a moment before answering. 23 years. 20-3 years. Cooper stood frozen in front of that figure, as if the number had physical mass, as if it had landed on his chest and crushed something that would never regain its original shape. 23 years on Earth, while he spent a few hours in an impossible ocean looking for the remains of someone who had already been dead for decades. Tom was now over 30 years old. Murph, the little girl who didn't come down the stairs to say goodbye, was an adult woman, and he hadn't been there for any of it. The Endurance had a time-delayed messaging system. The accumulated videos waited in the transmission queue like a pile of letters no one had been able to read. Cooper sat in front of the screen with the stiffness of someone who knows that what he is about to see cannot be unseen. The messages began to play. Tom first. Tom greeted him with the awkwardness of a teenager who never entirely knew how to talk to his father, who grew up turning that awkwardness into distance, distance into dirt, dirt into identity. Tom worked the farm. Tom had gotten married. Tom had a son. Tom had lost that son. Tom's messages were brief, functional, like status reports from someone who learned not to need what wasn't available. Then, Murph. It took Murph years to send him a message. Her first ones were from a young woman, furious, with that cold anger that is more painful than shouting because it never tires, because it survives without oxygen. She told him she hated him with the precision of someone who has thought a lot about which words hurt the most. She told him he never should have left. She told him it was her birthday, that she had waited and he hadn't said anything. And of course he hadn't said anything, because he didn't know it was her birthday. Because on Miller's planet, time didn't have the same pulse as on Earth. Because physics makes no allowances for birthdays. Cooper watched the messages alone. He didn't cry, or if he cried, it was in a way that made no noise, that asked for no witnesses. When he finished, he sat for a long time staring at the blank screen. This is what most people don't understand about Interstellar when they watch it. For the first time, the movie isn't about black holes. It is about what it means to lose time with the people you love, and whether there is any way in the vast and cold machinery of the cosmos to get it back. There was enough fuel left to reach one of the two remaining planets, Mann's or Edmund's. Edmund's data was promising, but his signal was weaker. Mann's data was more solid, more detailed, and Dr. Mann was still transmitting, which theoretically indicated there was something on that world worth pursuing. Cooper and Ramilly voted to go to Mann. Amelia Brand voted for Edmunds. And in her voice there was something that went beyond scientific analysis, something she herself named with an honesty that surprised everyone. She loved Edmunds. The astronaut who had gone to Edmund's planet was someone she loved, and that influenced her choice. Cooper looked at her with something akin to respect. Not because what she was saying was convenient, but because it was unapologetically true. But the logic of the numbers won. They set course for Mann's planet. Back on Earth, Murph Cooper had grown up to become the scientist her father always knew she would be. She worked directly with Professor John Brand on the central problem that was supposedly the other half of the mission. A gravitational equation whose solution would allow them to build the infrastructure to evacuate humanity from Earth, not to colonize a new world with frozen embryos, but to take the real people, the real families, the old and the young, and those who couldn't travel any other way. That was the official promise, Plan A. But Professor Brand was dying. On his deathbed, his days numbered and the weight of what he knew crushing him more than the illness. Brand called for Murph and confessed what he had kept hidden for decades. The equation had no solution, not with the available data. To complete it, they needed information that could only be obtained from inside a black hole, from that point of no return where gravity collapses every known structure of space-time, and no one who entered a black hole could come out to tell what they had seen. Plan A had always been impossible, always. What Professor Brand had sent Cooper and the rest of the Endurance crew on was a mission with only one viable outcome. Plan B: reach a habitable planet, release the 5,000 frozen embryos the ship carried, and start a new human civilization from scratch. Without the living, without those left on Earth, without Donald, without Tom, without Murph. Cooper didn't know this yet. On Mann's planet, they landed on a world of solid clouds and structural cold, where the atmosphere froze into layers that cracked beneath their feet like ice on a lake in winter. They woke Dr. Mann from his cryosleep pod with the care of someone bringing a man back to life who has been alone for years, completely alone on an inhospitable planet with nothing but his own thoughts and his own measurements and his own certainty that the distress signal he sent would eventually be heard. Mann was fine. Mann was lucid. Mann was relieved in a way that overflowed in his eyes with an intensity anyone would have taken for gratitude, which no one recognized for what it truly was. They went out to explore the surface. Cooper and Mann walked together over a terrain that creaked and gave way beneath their boots, while Mann described the data he had collected, the possibilities he had identified, the potential that justified the positive signal he had transmitted years ago. He spoke fluently, with conviction, with the cadence of someone who has rehearsed these words many times, and then Cooper asked the right question. He asked something specific about the data, a technical detail that Mann should have known if he had truly been collecting information all those years. Mann hesitated. It was just an instant, barely a stumble in the rhythm of his words. But Cooper noticed it, because Cooper was the kind of person who notices those things, and in that instant, something colder and more alien than the planet's climate ran down his spine. Before he could process what that hesitation meant, Mann pushed him. The ground of Mann's planet was a perfect trap. Cooper fell backward, and the surface that had seemed solid gave way under his weight as if it had always been waiting for that moment. His hands searched for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. Only layers of ice and frozen rock that splintered under his gloves as his body descended down a crevasse that the geology of that world had been forming for millennia. Unaware that it would one day be useful to someone who wanted to kill a man, the impact at the bottom left him breathless. His helmet cracked and his vision fragmented into white flashes. Mann peered over the edge. His face, filtered through the visor of his own suit, didn't hold the expression of a man who has made a mistake. It held the expression of someone finishing something they started a long time ago. He spoke to him with the calm of a confession that has been held in for too long. The data was fake. Everything was fake. Mann's planet wasn't habitable. It never had been, and he had known it since the first weeks of exploration. He had faked his measurements with the same meticulousness he would have used to record real data, building a perfect technical illusion, because the truth was too unbearable to broadcast into the void, knowing no one would come looking for him. He had sent a positive signal because he wanted to live, not out of abstract cowardice, but out of the most human cowardice of all, the survival instinct that doesn't ask ethics for permission before acting. No human being, Mann said in a voice that sounded almost pedagogical, is prepared to die alone in space. Cooper tried to speak, tried to reason, But his helmet had a crack that widened with every breath, like a fissure in pressurized glass. And the time he had left with oxygen was finite, and growing more finite by the second. Mann activated something on the instruments of Cooper's suit before walking away. A detonation sequence. What no one knew yet was that Ramilly, back at the planet's temporary base, was examining one of Mann's data instruments with the innocent curiosity of a scientist, finding something that doesn't fit. The trap Mann had left in that instrument, designed to kill anyone who looked too closely, detonated. Romilly died without understanding what had happened. Just like that. That fast. That definitively. Amelia Brand reached Cooper before his oxygen ran out. She pulled him from the crevasse with an urgency that trembled in her arms, dragged him over the cracking surface, pushed him into the lander with the desperation of someone who doesn't yet know they've already lost Ramilly, who still believes they are only losing time. When she found out, when the silence on Ramilly's frequency told her everything words couldn't say, fast enough, Brand stopped for a moment. Just a moment. Then she kept moving her hands, because there was no other option but to keep moving her hands. Mann had reached Cooper's lander first. He had taken the controls with the hands of someone who knows how to pilot but doesn't know this specific ship, who lacks Cooper's muscle memory for its responses, its resistances, its mechanical quirks. He took off toward the Endurance, intending to dock manually and continue the mission on his own. Plan B, the embryos, the new civilization, with himself in command because he was the most veteran astronaut of the Lazarus Project, and in a mind twisted by years of loneliness and fear. That gave him some kind of right. The docking maneuver was a disaster. The process required exact synchronization between the ship's systems and the incoming module, a dance of Newtonian physics that doesn't forgive impatience. Mann forced the dock before pressurization was complete. The airlock gave way with a violence that space absorbed in silence, without drama, without the sound it would have had in a normal atmosphere. Mann was blown out. The Endurance spun out of control, shaken by the explosive decompression. Its navigation systems compromised, and its structure damaged in spots the diagnostics took several minutes to locate, and here is the astonishing answer to everything that followed. Cooper was the one who saved the Endurance. He arrived in the second module with Brand, assessed the situation in seconds, and executed a docking maneuver while the mothership was still spinning. Something no protocol considered possible, because protocols are written for situations engineers can imagine. And this was beyond all imagination. It was pure instinct, pure skill accumulated over years of piloting at the limits of the physically viable. The impact of the forced docking shook everything, but it worked. The Endurance was stabilized, damaged but functional. Mann had died in the vacuum. No drama, no redemption. Just the physical result of a decision made out of fear. Cooper and Brand looked at each other inside the ship. They were alone now. Doyle, dead in the ocean of Miller's planet. Ramilly, dead in Mann's trap. Mann, dead in the vacuum of his own despair. It was just the two of them, Tar's case, and a wounded ship orbiting a useless planet. With insufficient fuel to execute any conventional plan, Cooper did the math. He did it twice, because the first time he didn't want to believe the result. Then he showed it to Brand to reach Edmund's planet, the only one left. They needed to perform a gravitational slingshot maneuver around Gargantua. Use the black hole's gravity, drop toward it just enough to capture its energy, and shoot out toward Edmund's with the velocity their fuel couldn't provide. It was a possible maneuver, The numbers confirmed it, but the time dilation in Gargantua's proximity would come at a cost. Not as extreme as on Miller's planet, but real. Years, decades, perhaps. Cooper didn't tell Brand yet what he was considering doing inside it. There was a variable in the calculations that he saw clearly, one that would change everything if it worked. A possibility so improbable that saying it out loud would make it sound like madness. He needed the numbers to stay just numbers for a little while longer. Back on Earth, Murph Cooper was now over 30 years old and carried Professor Brand's betrayal like a stone in her chest. The equation she had spent years trying to solve was, according to Brand's deathbed confession, unsolvable without data no one could obtain. Plan A was a lie. Humanity on Earth had no possible salvation from within, but Murph didn't accept that there was something in the equation that didn't close the way it should if it were truly impossible. A hole in the mathematical logic that felt less like a limit and more like an unlocked door. And in her childhood bedroom, back at the farmhouse where Tom still lived amidst increasingly frequent dust storms, Murph found something. The watch her father had left her before going away was on the bookshelf where it had always been, and its second hand was moving in a way that shouldn't be possible. The watch's second hand was not following the rhythm of time. Murph watched it for a long time, before her scientific mind overcame the instinctive reaction to dismiss it as a mechanical error. Watches fail. Springs wear out. But this watch wasn't failing randomly. The second hand stopped, advanced, stopped again, with an irregularity that had internal structure, obeying a pattern her brain recognized before she could name it. It was Morse code. Someone was sending her a message through her father's watch. The surprising answer wasn't that there was a message. It was who it was coming from. It took Murph hours to decode it, sitting on the floor of her old bedroom with a pencil and paper, surrounded by the dust marks no one had cleaned since she was a child. Those parallel lines that years ago had led Cooper to NASA. What the watch was transmitting weren't words of comfort or simple instructions. It was data. Pure, dense, technical quantum data. The kind that could only exist in a place where gravity collapses the dimensions of space-time until what normally remains hidden forever becomes visible. Someone was inside Gargantua, and from inside there, they were giving her the missing data for the equation. Murph didn't know who it was yet, but something in her, somewhere beneath the logic and the science and the years of accumulated rage, knew that the hands moving that second hand were hands she had seen her entire life. Everything that seemed impossible was, somehow, converging. Interstellar reaches its most powerful turning point, not with an explosion, but with the silent recognition that the universe has been operating with a coherence. The characters were too small to see while they were inside it. Professor Brand had died not knowing that the solution he sought his whole life was being delivered from the future, transmitted through a watch a father had left his daughter under the guise of comparing time when he returned. Cooper never knew, when he gave Murph that watch, that he was building the most improbable communication channel in human history. Back on the Endurance, the ship approached Gargantua's perimeter of influence. From the safe distance where they still operated, the black hole was already visible not as darkness, but as absence, as a point where the universe ceased to have information to give. The accretion disk surrounding it glowed with an orange and white light that curved back on itself, following the contour of gravity, bending at angles the human eye was not designed to process without some degree of existential vertigo. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. It was the kind of beauty that doesn't invite you to come closer but warns you away. Cooper explained to Brand what he had in mind as the Endurance began its gravitational drop maneuver. There was no soft way to say it, so he said it straight. He and TARS were going to detach from the ship within Gargantua's gravity arc. They were going to drop deeper while Brand and Case used the thrust freed up by that separation to shoot off toward Edmund's planet. The physics allowed it. The calculations confirmed it. The cost was that Cooper wouldn't be able to follow her. Brand looked at him as if expecting him to add something else. An alternative. A pilot's trick to change the equation. Cooper had none. "Why you?" she asked, and Cooper didn't answer the way she expected. Not with arguments about who was the more qualified pilot or who was expendable for the mission. He answered with something more honest and more difficult, because he had to try something. Because if there was any chance, no matter how remote, that from inside Gargantua there existed information that could be saved and transmitted, he needed to be the one to try. For Murph, for everyone left on Earth waiting for a Plan A, they had been promised and robbed of before they even knew it existed. The separation happened in silence, as definitive things do in space. No dramatic soundtrack, no countdown, just the systems confirming the disconnection, and then the Endurance moving away toward the light and Cooper and TARS falling into the darkness. Brand didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because looking back doesn't change the physics. Edmund's planet turned out to be everything the numbers promised. A solid surface, a breathable atmosphere, skies that didn't crush you. Brand landed with Case on a world that smelled of possibility. Among the rocks and filtered light of an alien sun, and found the remains of Wolf Edmund's camp. The man she had loved and whose positive signal had been real from the start. Edmunds had died, but not in vain. He had found the right place. He had done the work before the work consumed him. Brand buried what was left of him with the care of someone who has no time for grief but refuses to skip it anyway. Then she started to build. She began to unload the embryos, to activate the life support systems, to lay the foundations of what would eventually be the continuation of the human species on a world that wasn't Earth but could become home. It was Plan B, executed by the hands of the only person from the crew who had made it there. A lone woman on an unknown planet, building the future with what was available because there was no option to wait for better conditions to arrive. That is what really happened on Edmund's planet while Cooper fell into Gargantua, while the universe folded around him into dimensions that human physics has no language to describe. Amelia Brand was planting the first seed of humanity in foreign soil, with steady hands and a broken heart and the quiet conviction of someone who understands that the most important work rarely looks the way we imagine when we dream of being heroes. Cooper crossed the event horizon and the universe. On the other side was not what anyone could have expected. The interior of Gargantua was not darkness. It was structure. Cooper understood this in the first few seconds, before his mind had time to classify what his eyes were sending it, before fear could comfortably settle somewhere in his nervous system. What surrounded the falling pod was not the black void any physicist would have predicted beyond the event horizon. It was geometry. A construction of dimensions stacked upon each other with the precision of something designed, something someone had built for a specific purpose and left there waiting for exactly this moment to arrive. TARS processed the data at a speed Cooper couldn't follow. The numbers arriving on the instruments had no precedent in any NASA database. In any theoretical model, Kip Thorne could have anticipated, even if his equations brushed them from the outside. They were inside something that had no name yet because no human being had ever been here before. To give it one, Cooper ejected his pod from the probe and fell deeper, and then the space changed. What unfolded around Cooper was a tesseract, a three-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional structure, built so that a human being limited to 3 dimensions of perception could interact with time as if it were physical space. Every panel around him was a moment. Every surface he could touch was a different instant of the exact same place. And that place was Murph's bedroom, his daughter's bedroom, reproduced infinitely in all directions, in every moment of its history, from when she was a little girl who believed in ghosts, to a woman seeking the solution to an equation that could save the human species. Cooper could look in any direction and find Murph in a different time, separated from her only by the thickness of a wall that was also the thickness of several years. And here is the key to everything. Interstellar has been building since its very first minute. Cooper was the ghost. It had always been him. The dust lines a 10-year-old girl had attributed to a supernatural presence were gravitational disturbances he himself had created from inside the tesseract, pushing from the other side of the dimensions with a desperate clumsiness he didn't yet know how to control. The books falling off the shelf, the patterns in the dust. It was all him, a man who hadn't even made the decision to enter the black hole yet, sending signals back in time from a point where time was not linear but simultaneous. The paradox was perfect and disturbing in equal measure. Cooper had found the NASA coordinates because future Cooper had guided him there. Future Cooper existed because past Cooper followed the coordinates. The loop was closed, self-consistent, impossible to break from the inside. The beings of the future, those entities who had built the tesseract, hadn't intervened in human history. They had built the structure so that a human being could intervene in his own history. And they had chosen Cooper not because he was special in an abstract sense, but because he was Murph's father. And Murph was the scientist who could use the data. Cooper was about to transmit love as a precision mechanism of the universe. The grandest idea Christopher Nolan has ever put into images. Cooper moved through the panels with the urgency of someone who knows this space will not last, that the structure will eventually collapse when its purpose has been fulfilled, that he has a closing window of time, even though in this place time is technically visible in all its simultaneous forms. He tried different methods of communication. He pushed books. He altered the dust. The despair of not being able to accurately transmit what he needed to transmit was the particular kind that arises when the tool exists but the channel isn't fine enough for the message. TARS had gathered the quantum data from inside Gargantua. The information Professor Brand had needed his entire life to complete the gravitational equation was now encoded in the robot's systems, waiting for a transmission channel that could cross the dimensional barrier. Cooper looked around, looked at all the panels of time, looked at the versions of Murph's room in every moment of its history, and then he saw the watch he had given his daughter before leaving. The watch Murph had kept on the shelf without moving it for decades because it was the only physical object that connected her father's time to hers. The watch with its analog mechanism, its gears, its hands that measured time in the only way human beings had found to trap it, by dividing it into units they could count. The second hand could be moved. With enough gravitational precision, the second hand could be moved in controlled patterns. And if it could move in controlled patterns, it could transmit Morse code. And if it could transmit Morse code, it could transmit TARS quantum data into the mind of the only person on Earth who knew exactly what to do with it. Cooper got to work. His fingers pushed against the dimensional surface with absolute concentration, feeling the resistance of the fabric of space-time as something that had texture, that gave way under the right pressure, that responded, although never as easily as he would have liked. The data was extensive. The transmission was slow, and with every passing second, the tesseract vibrated with a frequency that told him, wordlessly, that the available time was shrinking. On the other side, in a farmhouse bedroom on Earth, an adult woman named Murphy Cooper stared at her father's watch with the concentration of someone who has learned to read the language of the universe in its most unexpected forms. She decoded, she transcribed. The data filled pages and pages of dense mathematical notation, and at some point in that process, Murph stopped being just the daughter waiting for her father and became the scientist who was going to save humanity. The equation was solved. Plan A was now possible. Not as Professor Brand had conceived it, with the lie buried at its center, but for real, with the actual data transmitted from the most impossible place in the universe by a man who had crossed a black hole's event horizon out of love for his daughter. The tesseract collapsed. Cooper fell outward. The void returned him, not gently, not with the softness of something opening up to receive someone returning. The collapse of the tesseract expelled Cooper into normal space with the indifference of a structure that has fulfilled its function and no longer has use for the parts that inhabited it. He floated unconscious on the outskirts of Saturn's solar system, without a ship, without propulsion, with only his sealed suit keeping him alive as the stars spun around him in a bottomless silence. His suit's signal is what found him. A patrol ship operating in Saturn's rings picked up the emergency pulse and went to investigate with the practical curiosity of people who didn't expect to find anything more than debris. What they found was a living man, in perfect physiological condition, floating in a spot where no human being should exist. They took him to Cooper Station, a massive orbital facility spinning on its own axis, with the elegance of something that had taken generations to build, and whose name Cooper didn't immediately recognize because no one had called it. That back when he knew it, humanity had survived. Murph had completed the equation. The data Cooper transmitted from inside Gargantua had closed the mathematical problem Professor Brand had chased for decades with the wrong tool. The solution allowed them to build the gravitational manipulation technology that made it possible to lift the orbital stations, evacuate Earth in shifts, safeguard the living alongside the Plan B embryos. It hadn't been one thing or the other. It had been both, because the equation made it possible, and Murph executed it with the tenacity of someone who refused to accept impossible as the final answer. Cooper woke up in a white room with the disorientation of someone who has slept too long or too little, who doesn't know if hours or decades have passed because his body doesn't have that information yet. A doctor explained to him with the trained patience of someone who has delivered bad news in unexpected ways that he was physically fine, that several years had passed, that he was on Cooper Station, that there was someone who wanted to see him. The room where Murph waited had the light of places where people go to die with dignity. Not dark, not clinical, but filtered and warm, the kind that neither judges nor rushes. Murphy Cooper was over 90 years old and surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, an entire genealogy that existed because she had solved the unsolvable in a farmhouse bedroom with a piece of paper, a pencil, and the information a watch had given her in Morse code. Cooper walked into that room with the exact same body that had left Earth decades ago. relatively young due to the accumulated time dilation of his trips near black holes, and found himself face to face with his daughter, now an old woman. The distance between the two wasn't just the physical distance of a room. It was the distance of all the time he hadn't been there. All the versions of Murph he hadn't known: the furious little girl, the young scientist, the woman who saved humanity, the mother, the grandmother, the elderly woman who now looked at him with a mixture of love and peace that only people who have reached the end of something enormous and survived to know it possess. "I knew you'd come back," Murph said, not as a reproach, as confirmation of something she always knew. The same certainty that as a child made her look at the dust lines with more curiosity than fear. The conviction that the universe doesn't waste the messages it sends, even if it takes decades to reveal their origin. Cooper sat beside her. He took her hand with the hands that had pushed against the walls of the tesseract, the same hands that had held the Endurance's controls steady while it spun out of control, the same hands that had driven a pickup truck through the night following dust coordinates toward a destiny that changed everything. Those hands now held the hand of a woman who had carried his absence for an entire lifetime and turned it into fuel to do the impossible. There were no grand words. Interstellar, which had built its emotional arc with the patience of someone who knows exactly when to cash in what they've accumulated, chooses this moment with a sobriety that hurts more than any melodrama. Father and daughter in a white room. The time they couldn't share, visible in the difference between their bodies. The love that crossed a black hole, bending the rules of physics to deliver an urgent message. Murph died shortly after, surrounded by her family, on that orbital planet that bore her last name, because the world she saved decided that was the most fitting way to remember what it owed her. Cooper didn't stay, not because he didn't want to stay, not because the pain of losing her again wasn't real and heavy, but because Murph, in the final hours they shared, asked him not to. She told him what Cooper needed to hear to be able to move forward, that she had enough, that she had lived a full life, that no parent should have to watch their own child die while the work was still unfinished. The unfinished work had a name. It had coordinates. It had the face of a lone woman on a distant planet, building the future with what she had on hand. Tars was waiting in the hangar bay with the affectionate practicality that was his way of saying he was ready whenever Cooper was. Cooper took the controls of the smallest ship available, one of the ones the new orbital humanity had built with the technology Murph's equation had made possible, and set course for Edmund's planet, toward Amelia Brand, who never knew if anyone was coming. Edmund's planet didn't know anyone was coming. That was the nature of that place. Indifferent with the serenity of worlds that haven't yet learned human beings exist, that haven't yet received the disturbance of being named, catalogued, inhabited. The rocks harbored no urgency. The wind crossing the ochre and grey plains carried no messages. The stars above that strange sky shone with the same constancy they had maintained for millions of years before any creature on any planet could look up at them and assign them meaning. Amelia Brand had spent years alone in that meaning. She had built what she could build with what the Endurance had brought. The embryo life support systems ran with the stability that Nathan Crowley and his design team had incorporated into every component of the Endurance, as if they knew someone would eventually have to operate them without help on an unknown planet, with no instruction manual beyond what the crew itself had memorized during training. Brand had turned that memory into routine, routine into structure, structure into something that looked, if not exactly like hope, at least like purpose. The days on Edmund's planet were not like Earth days. The duration was different. The quality of the light was different. The weight of the silence was of a category that has no equivalent in any human language, because no human language was built to describe the loneliness of being the only conscious person within a radius of light years. Brand had learned to inhabit it, not to love it, not to resign herself to it in the passive way the word resignation suggests, but to recognize it as the specific territory where she had to operate and to work within its conditions without wasting energy resisting it. She thought of Cooper, not constantly, not with a paralyzing obsession, but with the discrete frequency of someone checking a variable they know they cannot control, but cannot ignore either. She had calculated, in her moments of greatest mathematical clarity, the odds of someone coming out of Gargantua alive. The numbers weren't cruel in their conclusions. They were simply honest in the way only numbers can be. The odds were low, not impossible. Low, the distinction mattered. And here is what few understand about Brand's decision to continue despite those numbers. It wasn't optimism sustaining her. It was something more solid and harder to name. Something resembling faith in its most secular and demanding form. The conviction that the work in front of you matters regardless of what happens with the variables you don't control. Cooper could be dead. Humanity on Earth could have collapsed before Murph's equation worked. Edmund's planet could turn out to be less habitable than the data suggested once actual colonization began. None of those possibilities changed what Brand had to do today. So she did it. She had set up the first incubation systems. She had mapped the immediate area's water resources, identified the geothermal energy sources the planet's surface offered with a generosity that seemed almost intentional, outlined the perimeters of what would eventually be a settlement capable of sustaining human life without relying on the supplies the Endurance brought. Every decision she made was a decision that would be made by someone expecting others to arrive, who assumes that eventually there will be more people who will need to find this work already done. It was a bet on the future made in complete solitude. It was the quietest act of faith in the entire movie. The weeks on Edmund's planet already had their own rhythm when the long-range sensors picked up something, a signal. Small, technical, the kind the Endurance's systems recognized as human-made because humanity has patterns in its communication, technologies that are as identifiable as a fingerprint. Brand paused what she was doing with the slowness of someone who doesn't want to move too fast for fear that reality will change if she makes too much noise receiving it. The signal grew stronger. Brand went outside the habitat module with her suit on, not because the atmosphere on Edmund's planet was unsafe at those concentrations, but out of protocol, out of the habit of so many years operating in environments where protocol is the difference between living and not living. The planet's sky was that shade between orange and grey that she had learned to read as sunset. Even though the light cycles here didn't match any terrestrial intuition her body still carried. On the horizon, a luminous smudge that was not a star. It was moving, descending. It had the unmistakable shape of something, built by human hands with the specific purpose of crossing space and landing on surfaces humanity did not know before someone decided to know them. Brand didn't run. She walked, with the cadence of someone who has waited long enough to have learned that the final distance isn't shortened by running but by walking with one's attention fully placed on every step, on every meter of ground between her and what was approaching, as if the entire planet deserved to be inhabited with the same presence she had brought to every lonely day of work. The ship landed with the sound ships, have when they touch solid ground after a lot of space, a dull, metallic thud, the sound of physics resolving the equation between mass and gravity with its characteristic practicality. The cooling systems hissed. The hatches took a moment to respond, while the sensors verified the outside atmosphere, and then the hatch opened. Cooper stepped onto the soil of Edmonds' planet with the same body he had when he left Earth, relatively intact thanks to decades of time dilation, with the hands that had pushed against the walls of the tesseract and the eyes that had seen the inside of Gargantua and the mind that had carried the promise to return as the most constant weight of all the journeys he had made. He stepped onto the strange soil of the planet Amelia Brand had been building for years as a home for a species that hadn't yet arrived, and he looked up. Brand was there, a few meters away, in her suit, with the years of loneliness in her eyes, with something that wasn't exactly surprise because some part of her had calculated that this was possible, that the odds weren't impossible, that the distinction mattered and that she had been right to let it matter. There were no words for that moment that wouldn't fall short of the moment itself. Edmonds' planet didn't know anyone had arrived. But now it did. Now it had two people standing on its surface under a sky that had never seen humans. At the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet, because names come later, when there's enough accumulated history for it to be worth telling. TARS processed data in the ship with the silent efficiency that was his nature. The planet's wind moved through the rocks with the sound of something that doesn't yet know it's the wind of home, and Cooper, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime of motion and loss and falling forward, stood still. Christopher Nolan's name appears in the credits of Interstellar as director and co-writer. But what those credits cannot capture is the scale of the obsession that precedes a project like this. Nolan saw Star Wars 12 times in the cinema when he was a child. His father took him to see Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey before he was old enough to understand its full philosophical implications. And the film stuck with him, not as entertainment, but as evidence that cinema could speak directly to the place in the brain where unanswered questions live. Alongside his brother Jonathan, he spent hours watching Super 8 footage of space launches. An uncle of the Nolan brothers had worked on NASA's Saturn program. The fascination with space was not an interest cultivated in adulthood to give intellectual weight to a commercial proposal. It was foundational. It was part of Christopher Nolan's mental architecture before Christopher Nolan even knew he was going to be a filmmaker. What makes the creative genesis of Interstellar fascinating as a case study is that the film did not begin with Nolan. It began with two people who met on a blind date organized by Carl Sagan, producer Linda Obstay, and theoretical physicist Kip Thorne met in the mid-1980s thanks to an introduction by Carl Sagan, the astronomer and science popularizer whose influence on the popular culture of science can hardly be overstated. Obst and Thorne had collaborated before on Contact, the 1997 film based on Sagan's novel, and that experience had shown them that real science and commercial cinema could coexist without either having to sacrifice too much of what made it valuable. From that prior collaboration was born a conversation about what Thorne called the most exotic events in the universe becoming accessible to humans: black holes, wormholes, time dilation as a lived experience, phenomena that theoretical physics described with precise equations but that no human being had yet touched with their own hands. Obst and Thorne developed an 8-page treatment and took it to Paramount Pictures in June 2006. Steven Spielberg expressed interest in directing. The project entered development with Spielberg attached, Jonathan Nolan was hired to write the script in March 2007, and everything seemed to follow the conventional trajectory of a high-budget science fiction project with a top-tier director at the helm. But in 2009, when DreamWorks, Spielberg's studio, split from Paramount to migrate to Walt Disney Studios, the project was left orphaned without a director. Paramount needed someone who could take this material to the level of ambition it deserved, and Jonathan Nolan, who had already spent 4 years working on the script and studying relativity at the California Institute of Technology to understand the science he needed to write, recommended his brother. Christopher Nolan joined the project in 2012. By that time, he already had one of the most extraordinary track records in contemporary commercial cinema behind him. He had taken a culturally exhausted superhero franchise and reconfigured it into a trilogy that redefined what could be expected from action cinema. Batman Begins in 2005, The Dark Knight in 2008, and The Dark Knight Rises in 2012. Before that, Memento in 2000 had established him as a filmmaker capable of turning the narrative structure itself into a dramatic tool, and The Prestige in 2006 had showcased his persistent interest in the ideas of duplicity, sacrifice, and the consequences of pushing an obsession to its logical limits. Inception in 2010 had been his most ambitious exploration up to that point to the architecture of consciousness and the nature of subjective reality, what all those films had in common, and what Interstellar would take to a new scale, was Nolan's conviction that cinema can be simultaneously spectacular and intellectually serious, that the deepest emotion does not come from visual effects, but from the ideas those visual effects serve. When Nolan met with Kip Thorne to discuss the project, he didn't arrive looking for scientific validation for things he had already decided to put on screen. He arrived with genuine questions about special and general relativity, about the physics of black holes, about what a human being might see and feel in the proximity of the event horizon of a rotating black hole. Thorne responded with equations. Nolan read the equations and turned them into narrative questions. Nolan's central creative vision for Interstellar was to resist the temptation to make a science fiction movie in the conventional sense of the term. On set, throughout production, the phrase most often heard, according to those who worked on the film, was "no, that feels to sci-fi." The spacesuits were bought at thrift stores and modified to look functional and worn rather than shiny and futuristic. The ship sets were designed with the claustrophobic density of submarines, where every centimeter has a purpose and nothing is decorative. The concept Nolan pursued was what he called the NASA aesthetic, that used future look that George Lucas had introduced in Star Wars and that Ridley Scott had pushed to its extreme in Alien. The feeling that technology is a practical tool with maintenance and wear, not an extension of the designer's fantasy, but where Interstellar breaks from its predecessors in the genre is in its insistence that the central story be a family story. Nolan became a father during the film's production, and he describes having watched the test sequences with a completely different emotional weight than when he wrote them. The separation between Cooper and Murph was not a convenient dramatic premise for him, but an exploration of something he felt was personally urgent, a father's fear of missing out on time with his children, the impossibility of being present in every version of their lives, the strangeness of loving someone who will inevitably grow into a version of themselves that you didn't fully know. This personal dimension infiltrated every creative decision of the film. The choice to anchor the story in imagery of the American Dust Bowl of the 1930s, that period of dust storms and starvation that devastated Middle America during the Great Depression, was not arbitrary. Nolan watched Ken Burns' documentary about the Dust Bowl in 2012 and directly contacted Burns and his producer, Dayton Duncan, to ask for permission to use interviews from the documentary in Interstellar. Those images of real people recalling the dust, the hunger, the tenacity of those who stayed to cultivate land that didn't want to be cultivated, appear in the film as a texture of documentary truth that anchors its science fiction in something viscerally human. The alliance between Paramount Pictures, Warner Brothers Pictures, and Legendary Pictures to finance Interstellar was in itself an unusual story. Warner Bros., which had worked with Nolan on the entire Batman trilogy and Inception, negotiated with Paramount to obtain a stake in the co-production under unconventional terms. Warner traded its rights to a future film in the Friday the 13th franchise and a stake in a potential second feature film based on South Park, while Legendary Pictures agreed to trade its stake in Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice in exchange for financing approximately 25% of Interstellar. Paramount reported that Nolan would receive a salary of $20 million plus 20% of the gross, figures that reflected his position as one of the most bankable directors in global cinema at the time. Nolan visited NASA's facilities and the private space program, SpaceX, during pre-production, looking not so much for technical details to add to the script as for the feel of the real spaces, where people work who think about going to space as their daily job. He wanted the movie to have the smell of those places. Metaphorically speaking, that mix of extraordinary ambition with mundane logistics that characterizes institutions, doing things no one has ever done before. The result of all that context and preparation was a film whose vision is at once enormously personal and universally accessible, which touches upon the greatest questions humanity has asked about its place in the cosmos and anchors them in the smallest and most universal experience there is, the love between a father and his daughter, and the time lost between the two without either of them wanting it. The script for Interstellar has a development history that spans almost a decade, and in that history are decisions, abandonments, and transformations that reveal as much about the movie that came to exist as about the movies that could have been but weren't. Jonathan Nolan was commissioned to write the script in March 2007, and he spent the next 4 years building a story from the science outward, to do so with the seriousness the material demanded. He enrolled in relativity courses at the California Institute of Technology, studying alongside physicists who spent their careers thinking about the same questions the script attempted to dramatize. It was an extraordinary investment of time for a screenwriter working on a commercial project, and it reflects something about the tone Jonathan wanted for the material. He didn't want the science to be decoration. He wanted it to be the architecture. Kip Thorne functioned throughout the development process as a scientific consultant and executive producer, and his influence on the script was deeper than that of the conventional technical advisor who appears in Hollywood movie credits to lend respectability to speculative science fiction. Thorne not only verified that the phenomena described in the script were physically possible, he actively proposed ideas based on his own research, suggested phenomena the script could explore, and set constraints on what could be shown. The agreement between Thorne and the Nolans was that the movie would not show anything that violated known physical laws, and that speculative elements would be clearly identifiable as speculative rather than presented as established physics. One of the elements Jonathan Nolan included in his early drafts, and that Christopher later removed, was the use of gravitational waves as a mechanism to detect the wormhole. The decision to remove them was aesthetic, not scientific. Christopher felt it added a layer of technical complexity that the general public would not be able to follow without losing the emotional thread of the story. The ironic detail, which Christopher Nolan himself has mentioned in interviews with a touch of melancholy, is that LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, detected actual gravitational waves for the first time in September 2015. Barely a year after Interstellar's release. Had he kept that element in the script, the movie would have anticipated one of the most important scientific discoveries in modern history when Christopher Nolan took control of the project in 2012. He was faced with a script that Jonathan had developed with a different orientation than the one he wanted to give it. Jonathan had built a story more focused on the scientific and cosmological aspects, while Christopher wanted to anchor everything in the emotional experience of family separation. He merged his brother's script with one of his own that he had been developing in parallel for years, keeping Jonathan's scientific structure, especially his conception of the first hour on the devastated Earth, but reorienting the dramatic heart of the story toward the relationship between Cooper and Murph. The decision to establish the future world of Interstellar as a degraded version of the rural United States of the present, rather than a technologically advanced but ecologically collapsed future, was one of the most important Christopher made in the adaptation process. It was counterintuitive for a big-budget sci-fi movie. The first act takes place on dusty farms, with pickup trucks and baseball and kitchen conversations, with a deliberately mundane visual palette that at no point visually anticipates the cosmic grandeur to come. That decision worked because it created the necessary contrast for space to feel like something genuinely other, genuinely incomprehensible in its scale, rather than a familiar extension of the world the viewer already knows. The narrative structure of the script operates in 3 simultaneous temporal layers that the viewer discovers gradually. The first is Cooper's story in space, linear on its surface but distorted by the time dilation that makes his time not correspond to Earth's time. The second is Murph's story on Earth, which advances normally but is constantly in relation to Cooper's time, creating an emotional asymmetry that is the central engine of the film. The third is the story of the distant future, the beings who built the tesseract, who in the final script are never shown directly but are inferred through their works. A highly elegant, dramatic decision that avoids the trap of the expository third act that has ruined many ambitious sci-fi films, and here is what few understand about the construction of the dialogue in Interstellar. Jonathan Nolan, who is also the creator of the series Westworld, has a philosophy about science fiction dialogue that prioritizes naturalness over technical precision. The characters in Interstellar don't speak like textbooks, even though they handle concepts of general relativity. They speak like people who have internalized those concepts to the point where they no longer feel the need to fully explain them every time they use them. In the same way a pilot doesn't explain aerodynamics every time they adjust their altitude. This decision has narrative consequences. The film trusts the viewer to pay attention without having everything explained to them, which generated the critical polarization Interstellar has experienced since its release, with one sector of the audience feeling alienated by the density of the material and another finding exactly what they were looking for in that density. The adaptation of the plot also involved decisions about which elements of the Lazarus Project to show and which to leave in the dark. The original 12 astronauts of the project are mentioned, but only 3 have direct relevance to the story. Miller, whose planet is the first they visit. Edmonds, whose planet is the final destination. And Mann, whose planet becomes the setting for the darkest twist in the film. The decision not to show the original expeditions of these astronauts was narratively smart. It maintains the mystery of what they found and preserves the tension of discovery that the viewer experiences alongside Cooper. The character of Dr. Mann was Christopher Nolan's most significant addition to his brother's material. Mann did not exist in Jonathan's early drafts, or at least not in the form he takes in the final film. He is the character Interstellar uses to explore the darkest question of the entire movie. What does the fear of death do to a person's morality when no one is watching? Mann falsified his data, set a trap for his crewmates, and tried to murder Cooper, all motivated by the most basic survival instinct. The same instinct that under normal circumstances we would call cowardice, but which in the extreme isolation of deep space reveals something about the architecture of human consciousness that is more uncomfortable to categorize the choice not to show the tesseract as a purely digital construct, but to build it as a physical set with CGI extensions, reflects the script's overall production philosophy. Whenever possible, make real what the script describes, because physical reality produces performances that digital reality cannot. Matthew McConaughey moved through a real set when he explored the tesseract, touched real surfaces, and felt the real geometry of the space that Nathan Crowley and his team built with wood, light, and materials that physically responded to the actor's presence. The final result is a script that operates simultaneously as a survival thriller, a family drama, and a philosophical essay on time, love, and humanity's place in the cosmos, three genres that rarely coexist in the same space, and which in Interstellar do so with a fluidity that took years of work and multiple drafts to find. The casting of Interstellar began with a mental image Christopher Nolan had of his protagonist, and that image was not of an action star. Nolan wanted an everyman, not in the sense of being bland or charmless, but in the literary sense of the term, someone the average viewer could project themselves onto without the obstacle of a presence too singular, too specific, too marked by previous roles that would contaminate the reading of the character. Cooper had to be the kind of man who exists in every small town in the world, smart without showing it off, capable without needing anyone to know it, kind without being soft. The kind of man you might meet at a minor league baseball game on a Saturday morning and never imagine is about to pilot a ship through a wormhole. The casting decision that changed the movie came when Nolan saw an early cut of Mud, the 2012 film directed by Jeff Nichols. In Mud, Matthew McConaughey played a fugitive on the Mississippi River, with a presence that was at once magnetic and completely stripped of artifice. An actor who had learned, after years of romantic comedies that underutilized his talent, to trust in stillness. McConaughey was in the midst of what film critics informally dubbed the McConaissance, a second phase of his career that included his work in Killer Joe, Magic Mike, and the series True Detective, where he replaced the superficial charm of his early Hollywood years with something rougher and more interesting. Nolan went to visit him directly on the True Detective set in Louisiana to offer him the role. What no one mentions often enough when discussing casting in Interstellar is that the choice was risky from the studio's perspective. In 2013, McConaughey was not a name that guaranteed box office returns in the way actors who headline action franchises do. He was respected, he was a critical darling, but he had not yet proven he could open a $1-100-and-$60-5 million sci-fi film. Nolan's bet was that McConaughey's emotional authenticity would be worth more than the brand familiarity of other actors considered for the role. For the role of Dr. Amelia Brand, Nolan invited Anne Hathaway to his house and handed her the script directly. It was a gesture that reflected both the extreme confidentiality Nolan maintains around his projects and the trust he already had in Hathaway after directing her as Selina Kyle in The Dark Knight Rises. Hathaway read the script during that visit and accepted. Brand is a character that requires something specific from her performer: the ability to communicate scientific rigor and emotional vulnerability simultaneously, without either cancelling out the other. When Brand tells Cooper that love might be a force of the universe as real and measurable as gravity, the line requires an actor who delivers it with the conviction of someone who believes it and the self-awareness that it sounds extraordinary. And Hathaway executes that tension with a precision that makes the moment work where, in other hands, it could have turned into unintentional parody. Casting Jessica Chastain as adult Murph was one of the film's most important decisions, because Chastain carries the emotional weight of the third act with very little narrative support. For much of the film, adult Murph is working on a mathematical problem the viewer cannot fully see. Processing a rage against her father the viewer has only seen in fragments, and eventually having a revelation that must be communicated as a moment of genuine catharsis, even though the surrounding circumstances are highly abstract. Chastain was contacted while filming Miss Julie in Northern Ireland and received the script via special courier. Logistics that reflect the level of secrecy Nolan maintained around the project during pre-production. The role of Dr. Mann was the most unexpected in the cast. Originally, according to reports at the time, the role was offered to Indian actor Irfan Khan, whose international career included Slumdog Millionaire and the first Jurassic World movie. Khan declined due to scheduling conflicts, and Matt Damon took the role in August 2013. The choice of Damon was deliberately counterintuitive. He is one of the actors most identified with accessible heroism in Hollywood cinema. The man who saves space missions in The Martian, the agent who never betrays in Bourne. Casting Damon as the character who turns out to be Interstellar's moral villain, the coward who falsifies data and attempts to murder his crewmates, works precisely because it goes against the grain of what the audience associates with his on-screen presence. His appearance in the film was kept a secret until its release. Michael Caine as Professor Brand marked his fifth collaboration with Nolan, following the Batman trilogy, The Prestige, and Inception. The relationship between the two holds the comfort and efficiency of two people who have learned to work together, to the point where communication doesn't always need to be verbal. Caine brings to Professor Brand a moral authority that makes his final betrayal the confession that Plan A was always a lie genuinely devastating, rather than merely surprising. An actor with less moral presence in the role could have made the revelation feel like a cheap thriller twist. Caine makes it feel like a tragedy. John Lithgow as Donald, Cooper's father-in-law, was a choice Nolan made seeking genuine warmth for the first act. Lithgow has a rare ability to communicate affection without sentimentality, and Donald needed to be believable as the emotional anchor of the Cooper family during the father's absence, the adult who maintains routines and values in a world fraying at the edges. His scenes with McConaughey have the texture of a real family relationship, with its specific silences and its economies of affection. Mackenzie Foy, the actress who plays 10-year-old Murph, was selected from hundreds of girls and was fundamental in establishing the film's central dynamic. The scene where Murph doesn't come down to say goodbye to her father relies entirely on the audience having believed in the relationship between McConaughey and Foy during the first 20 minutes. And Foy delivers a performance of an emotional maturity and specificity that very few adult actors could match in a role of this complexity. The young Murph needs to simultaneously be a 10-year-old who believes in ghosts and a scientific mind inheriting her father's curiosity. And Foy navigates that duality with a naturalness that makes the transition to Chastain's adult Murph believable. Even though the two actors don't look alike physically, Ellen Burstyn, who plays the elderly Murph in the final scenes, came to the project in a capacity that the entire cast recognized as something special. The final scene between Cooper and his dying daughter required something extraordinarily difficult from Burstyn to communicate decades of lived life, resolved anger, and a love that survived absence. In just a few minutes of shared screen time with an actor who physically hasn't seemed to age while she has aged a lifetime, Burstyn brings to that scene the texture of an entire career. The same actress who in The Exorcist and Requiem for a Dream proved she can inhabit human pain without turning it into a spectacle. Timothy Chalamet, in one of his first major film roles, played the teenage Tom with the emotional restraint the role required. Tom is a character defined by what he doesn't express, by the distance he builds with his father before his father leaves, which later becomes the distance between him and everything that could have been otherwise. Chalamet captures that interiority with an economy that anticipates the extraordinary career to come. Casting director John Papsadera, who has worked with Nolan on all his films since Memento, built a cast where every actor, from the leads to the single-scene roles, operates with the same philosophy of authenticity over artifice that defines Nolan's direction. The result is an ensemble that feels like a real world rather than a production, where supporting characters have visible lives beyond their narrative functions, and where no character exists solely to move the plot forward. Matthew McConaughey built Joseph Cooper from the inside out, using the methodology of an actor who learned, during the years of his professional reinvention, that the truest characters are not built by adding layers, but by stripping them away. McConaughey's preparation for the role was less physical than psychological. There was no dramatic bodily transformation to undergo, no new accent to master. What the role demanded was something harder to rehearse, the credibility of a man who loves with an intensity that doesn't need to be demonstrated because it is simply part of his framework. Cooper doesn't talk about his feelings the way Hollywood scripts usually ask their protagonists to articulate them. He carries them in his body, in the way he looks at his kids during breakfast, in the tension of his shoulders when he hears something worrying, in the specific pause he takes before making decisions he knows will cost him. McConaughey found that emotional register by working from the personal experience of fatherhood, at a period in his life when his own children were small and the idea of a prolonged absence had concrete, rather than abstract resonances. McConaughey's most memorable performance in Interstellar doesn't happen in space. It happens in front of a screen on the Endurance, when Cooper watches the accumulated messages from his children after 23 years of time dilation on Miller's planet. The scene has no visual effects, no music swelling at the most acute moments, no technical artifice to carry the emotional weight. It is McConaughey alone in front of a camera, processing the pain of a man who has just discovered he missed his son's entire childhood, his daughter's adolescence, the first grandson who was born and died while he spent 3 hours on an impossible ocean. What McConaughey does in that scene, the way the crying comes and he controls it, and it comes again with a specificity that doesn't look acted but lived, is considered by many acting critics as one of the best moments of his career, and possibly one of the most honest performances of his generation in big-budget cinema, but there are subtler layers in McConaughey's work that the casual viewer doesn't always register consciously, even if they feel them. The way Cooper talks to TARS has a specific warmth that isn't what he reserves for humans, but it also isn't the coldness with which he would treat a tool. It is the tone of someone who has learned that intelligence deserves respect regardless of the form it takes. A stance that says something about Cooper's character before the script explicitly states it. The scene in the tesseract, where Cooper realizes he has always been his daughter's ghost, required McConaughey to simultaneously communicate awe, despair, determination, and love for emotional states that in the body of an average actor would have fought against each other. McConaughey layers them in such a way that each is visible without any cancelling the others out. Jessica Chastain's performance as adult Murph operates in a completely different register, more internal, more contained, built on the premise that a person who has carried 30 years of rage toward her father finally finds a way to resolve it, not through confrontation, but through work. Chastain prepared for her role by studying the behavior of real scientists working on complex problems, looking for the specific way intense intellectual focus alters posture, breathing, and the way the eyes move. Adult Murph isn't the furious child we see in the flashbacks. She is someone who turned her anger into fuel and burned it all in the direction of a problem that mattered. Chastain's most powerful moment in the film is when Murph sets the fire at Tom's farm. It is a seemingly irrational act from a character we have known as deeply rational, and Chastain plays it not as an emotional breakdown, but as a cold, deliberate decision to destroy what needs to be destroyed to create the conditions where the important thing can be seen. The performance doesn't explain the character's logic because the character doesn't need to explain herself. Chastain trusts the viewer the same way the script trusts them. Anne Hathaway faced the specific challenge of making the film's most controversial speech believable, the moment where Dr. Brand argues that love might be a measurable physical force of the universe, a signal pointing beyond the dimensions we know. Spoken by a character established as a rigorous scientist, the speech risks sounding like a sentimental capitulation to the script's emotional logic. Hathaway saves it from that risk by delivering it with the discomfort of someone who is formulating a hypothesis aloud that she knows her colleagues won't easily accept, rather than with the comfort of someone stating an already accepted truth. There is a scientific vulnerability in how she says it that turns what could have been a weakness in the script into one of its most genuinely moving moments. Matt Damon has roughly 20 minutes of screen time in Interstellar, and in those 20 minutes, he must complete a character arc that goes from apparent redemption to revealed betrayal, passing through justification, fear, and violence, all while maintaining the moral ambiguity needed so that Mann isn't just a villain, but a warning about what extreme loneliness can do to anyone's ethical architecture, even someone considered honorable. Damon succeeds because he carefully avoids the temptation to play Mann as someone who knows he is the villain. He plays him as someone who genuinely believes his decisions were the only possible ones under the circumstances he faced, which is more terrifying than any calculated evil. The chemistry between McConaughey and Hathaway is one of the elements that sustains the second half of the film, where the two characters find themselves alone facing decisions that define the mission's fate. It isn't conventional romantic chemistry, even though the film subtly suggests it. It is the chemistry of two people who deeply respect each other and have spent enough time in impression situations to trust the other's judgment even when they disagree. The scene where Cooper explains to Brand what he plans to do with Gargantua, the separation both know is likely Emotionally, because the two actors have spent the entire film building a relationship that earns that weight. Bill Irwin's work as the voice and physical presence of Tars deserves specific mention because it is perhaps the most invisible and essential acting job of the entire production. Tars is a robot deliberately designed not to look like a human being, an articulated monolith moving with its own geometry, but boasting a personality so clearly defined, with its dry humor programmed at 90% and its loyalty absolutely unprogrammed, but built throughout the mission that the viewer experiences it as a character with an inner life. That is entirely the work of Irwin, who physically operated the robot on set while also providing the voice, finding in technical restriction an expressive freedom that actors with human bodies sometimes lack. There is a scene in Interstellar that lasts less than 2 minutes and contains more memorable supporting performances per square foot than most entire movies. It is the parent-teacher meeting scene at Murph's school, where Cooper listens to the teachers explain to students that the Apollo missions were a hoax fabricated to bankrupt the Soviet Union. It is a brief scene, designed to establish the social context of the future world where humanity has abandoned the space dream and decided it needs farmers, not explorers. But in that scene, the school principal, played by David Oyelowo, and the teacher, played by Colette Wolfe, construct, with extraordinary economy, an entire value system that Cooper must navigate for the rest of the first hour, an atmosphere of defensive pragmatism. That explains why NASA operates in secret and why Cooper feels like an outsider in the world he inhabits. David Oyelowo, who that same year would deliver one of the most powerful performances of the decade in Selma as Martin Luther King Jr., uses his few minutes in Interstellar to create a character who isn't malicious but convinced, an administrator who genuinely believes he is preparing children for the real world as it is, which makes him more unsettling than if he was simply an antagonist. It is the kind of supporting performance great actors deliver in other directors' projects, fully committed, with no sign that the actor considers the role lesser than their main work. The relationship between Casey Affleck as adult, Tom Cooper, and McConaughey as his father is one of the film's most subtly devastating elements, precisely because so much of it occurs across a video screen with decades of delay. Affleck built Tom as a man defined by his father's absence, not in the sense of articulated trauma, but in the quieter, more permanent sense of someone who learned not to need what was unavailable. And that adaptation cost him some of his capacity to need in general. Tom's video messages that Cooper watches on the Endurance are short, informative, almost administrative. And within that brevity lies the entire story of a son who decided long ago to stop waiting. Wes Bentley as Doyle has the most abrupt fate of the main cast, and the intelligence of his performance lies in how, in his limited time, he establishes a character worth mourning when he disappears. Doyle is methodical, loyal, the kind of person who follows procedures because procedures exist for a reason. His death on Miller's planet, swept away by the wave while making sure Brand reaches the module before him, is not a heroic moment in the conventional cinematic sense. It is a moment of pure terror followed by absence. Bentley gives that absence weight because he built a present character while he had him. David Gyasi as Ramilli is perhaps the most intellectually interesting character in the Endurance ensemble, and Gyasi plays him with a serenity resulting not from a lack of emotion, but from someone who has found equanimity through a very specific path, the genuine acceptance that the universe is massive and human life is brief, and that this equation isn't a reason for nihilism, but for curiosity. Ramilly spends 23 years orbiting on the Endurance, while Cooper and Brand are on Miller's planet, studying the wormhole with the patience of a scientist who understands that some questions aren't in a hurry. When Cooper and Brand return, and Ramilly awaits them with that expression that isn't entirely relief, Gayassi communicates with a single glance the weight of 2 decades of productive solitude and the strangeness of reuniting with people who, to him, aged 23 years in 3 hours. The dynamic among the Endurance crew members works because Nolan insisted the actors spend time together before shooting, not in formal rehearsals, but in conversations, over meals, in the kind of informal proximity that builds the familiarity the camera detects, even if the script doesn't mention it. As a result, when the crew discusses mission decisions in the Endurance's briefing room, the viewer feels these people know each other, that they have history, that their agreements and disagreements stem from real relationships and not narrative needs. Topher Grace as Getty, adult Murph's colleague and eventual romantic partner, is a character the script utilizes with an economy Nolan has mastered well. His presence in Murph's Earthbound story emotionally anchors what would otherwise be a pure science plot, gives Murph someone to talk to other than Professor Brand, and establishes that her life has dimensions beyond work that the viewer doesn't fully see but can infer. Grace plays Getty with the discretion of someone who understands his role is to make the main character look better, and he does it without the effort showing. Ellen Burstyn's performance as elderly Murph is brief and perfect. It arrives in the 3rd act, when the film has already spent all its emotional ammunition and the viewer believes they can't be hit any harder. Burstyn proves they can. Her elderly Murph isn't bitter, she isn't resentful. She doesn't carry the rage that defined younger Murph. She is at peace in the specific way that people who did the work that mattered and finished it are at peace. When she tells Cooper that no parent should have to watch their own child die, there is something in her voice that goes beyond character wisdom. It is the texture of an actress who has lived enough to know it's true. The entire Interstellar ensemble operates under the same acting philosophy Nolan has cultivated across all his collaborations. Restraint as an expressive tool, in a genre where visual scale tends to push actors toward emphasis and gesticulation, toward performances that need to compete with effects to be seen. The Interstellar cast consistently moves in the opposite direction. The film's most powerful moments are its quietest. The ones that trust the viewer will lean in to look for the demotion instead of waiting for the emotion to be thrown at them. That trust, shared between the director and every cast member, is what distinguishes Interstellar's performances from the functional acting of most sci-fi films of its budget. They are not actors in a world of visual effects. They are people in a world trying to be real, even if its physical phenomena lie beyond any known human experience. Interstellar's production design began with a philosophical decision that defined everything that followed. And that decision was this: nothing in this movie should look like it belongs to the future. Nathan Crowley, the production designer who had worked with Christopher Nolan since Batman Begins and had built the sets for the Batman trilogy, Inception, and The Prestige, received the strangest brief of his career when Nolan explained his vision for Interstellar. The film's future shouldn't have a future aesthetic. The farms should look like real farms from the 1930s, degraded by time and dust, without a single visual element saying this is tomorrow. The spaceships should look like work equipment, not technological fantasies. The interiors of the orbital stations should look like what NASA would actually build if it had 50 more years of experience. Functional, dense, full of redundant systems and analog switches and parts, clearly designed to be repaired by human hands with conventional tools. Crowley's first task was the world of Earth, that near future devastated by the blight, killing crops one by one. To establish the visual palette for that world, Nolan and Crowley extensively studied photographs of the 1930s American Dust Bowl, that period of dust storms and famine documented by Dorothea Lange with a compassionate brutality that forever changed how the photographic world understood poverty. The houses in the first act of Interstellar have that specific texture of wood that has weathered too much sun and too much wind, of curtains that filter the dust because the windows are never completely sealed, of interiors where the dirt gets in no matter how much you clean. Crowley built those sets in Alberta, Canada, with an attention to detail that goes beyond what any camera could entirely capture. Because Nolan believes actors need to inhabit completely real spaces to give completely real performances. The cornfield Crowley planted in Alberta for the dust storm sequence is perhaps the most impressive and least celebrated production design element of the entire film. 500 acres of real corn, planted months before filming to ensure it was at the exact stage of growth the script required, and destined to be destroyed in a storm sequence that lasts less than 10 minutes on screen. The production teams used industrial fans to create the clouds of synthetic cellulosic dust simulating the real storms of the Dust Bowl. And the scale of the operation was such that actors and crew wore protective masks between takes. McConaughey has described shooting those sequences as physically disorienting in the best possible way. The sensation of actually being in the middle of something he couldn't control. The design of the Endurance, the mission's mothership, stemmed from a conversation between Crowley and Nolan about what real spacecraft would look like decades from now if NASA had enough budget and time to develop them. Crowley took the International Space Station as a primary reference, not for its aesthetics but for its design philosophy, the idea that every inch has a function, that nothing is decorative, that systems have redundancy because failure is not an abstract possibility, but a statistical certainty the design must anticipate. The resulting Endurance is a circular structure of 12 modular pods, designed so the viewer can intuit the function of each component without anyone explaining it. To them, the Endurance interiors were built as complete physical sets, not as the partial fragments most productions build to minimize costs and then extend digitally. Nolan wanted the actors to be able to move through the ship's corridors without the camera finding set edges, without that sense of artificially limited space that CGI can never fully disguise from the actors, even if it can hide it from the viewer. The claustrophobic density of the Endurance's interiors is real, because the physical space of the set was genuinely limited. And that limitation modified the performances in ways Nolan specifically sought. For the extraterrestrial planets, Crowley and Nolan made the strategic decision to use real locations. Instead of building sets and supplementing them with CGI, Miller's Planet was shot in Iceland, where the North Atlantic coast provides the kind of waterscape and low sky the script required. Mann's Planet was filmed on the Svinefellsjökull glacier, also in Iceland, where the ice has a specific texture and light that no set could replicate. The team transported spaceship mock-ups weighing roughly 10,000 pounds to Iceland, a logistically complicated and costly decision Nolan justified with the same argument that justifies all his production decisions. Actors need real objects to act in a real way. The Miller's Planet sequence presented one of the film's most creative design challenges: how to visually represent the scale of the waves the planet produces due to Gargantua's gravitational proximity. The waves on Miller's planet are, according to the film's physics, as tall as multi-story buildings, and they move at speeds the eye cannot anticipate due to their scale. Crowley designed the environment so the waves were visible on the horizon before arriving, giving them a looming, threatening presence that the sequence exploits with timing that is simultaneously cinematic and physically plausible. The tesseract, the hyperdimensional space inside Gargantua where Cooper interacts with his daughter's time, was the most conceptually ambitious design challenge of the entire production. Crowley collaborated with Paul Franklin, DNEG's visual effects supervisor, to build a structure that was simultaneously a habitable physical set and a four-dimensional digital extension. The solution was to build an actual set of illuminated corridors representing the three-dimensional space of the tesseract, with transparent walls facing screens that projected Murph's room at different points in time, and then extending that space with CGI effects that multiplied the corridors to infinity in all directions. Costume design, led by Mary Zophers, who had previously worked with the Coen brothers on No Country for Old Men and True Grit, followed the same philosophy of functionality without futurism. The Endurance crew's spacesuits lack the reflective shine of conventional sci-fi. They are work suits, with the kind of wear and tear that objects worn by real people in extreme conditions for prolonged periods would have. Earth's wardrobe, especially Cooper's in the first act, was deliberately designed with pieces that could be found in a contemporary thrift store, reinforcing the feeling that this future is not a technological fantasy but a degraded version of the present. The hidden details Interstellar's production design incorporates into every space are numerous, and most are not visible on a first viewing. Murph's bedroom has specific titles on its shelf, among the books that mysteriously fall, referencing the film's scientific themes. The Endurance's controls include interfaces blending analog and digital technology in a way, reflecting real aerospace engineering design philosophy. Edmund's planet, visible only in the final scenes, has a deliberately warmer, more vibrant color palette than the other planets visited, a subtle visual cue that this is the place that will work, the home humanity was looking for. Hoyt van Hoytema came too. Interstellar, with a reputation built on films that had little in common with each other except one thing. They all looked as if they had been photographed by someone who understood light not as illumination, but as emotional information. His work on the Swedish film Onscan in 2003, Spike Jonze's operatic Her in 2013, and especially Thomas Alfredson's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy in 2011, had shown an uncommon versatility, the ability to modulate a film's visual register based on what the story needed emotionally instead of imposing a uniform, aesthetic signature over all the material. Nolan chose him for Interstellar after Wally Pfister, his cinematographer on every previous film since Memento, decided to direct his own project, Transcendence. It was a significant break in Nolan's visual continuity, and choosing Van Hoytema wasn't a conservative substitution but a deliberate bet on a different voice. The most important technical decision Nolan and Van Hoytema made together was to shoot on photographic film, specifically in 35mm anamorphic Panavision and 70mm IMAX, at a time when the film industry had almost completely migrated to digital. The choice wasn't nostalgic or capricious. It was a decision based on concrete, physical properties that digital still couldn't replicate with the same fidelity. In 2013, the way film grain responds to low light, with an organic texture that digital noise doesn't match. the exposure latitude allowing both the deepest shadows and the most intense highlights to retain detail simultaneously, and especially the resolution of 70mm IMAX, which in that format is roughly 4 times greater than high-end digital at the time. The 70mm IMAX format was used strategically, not indiscriminately. Van Hoytema and Nolan reserved the full format sequences for the moments of greatest visual scale and emotional impact. The first sighting of the wormhole near Saturn, the approach to Gargantua, the sequences on the alien planets. In contrast, the intimate and domestic sequences of the first act on Earth were shot in the narrower anamorphic 35mm format, creating a perceptible difference between the human world and the cosmos Cooper eventually inhabits. The viewer doesn't need to know anything about camera formats to feel that difference. The universe physically opens up when Cooper leaves Earth, and that effect is the direct result of the format choice. Van Hoytema did something technically extraordinary for Interstellar that has no precedent in any previous cinematographer's work. He modified an IMAX camera to make it portable and operated handheld. Conventional IMAX cameras weigh between 30 and 50 kilograms and are designed to operate on tripods, cranes, or motion-controlled systems. Van Hoytema adapted them so he could physically carry them, to shoot the interiors of the Endurance with the proximity and immediacy that a handheld camera provides. That sensation of being inside the space with the characters instead of observing them from the outside. The largest camera the film world had ever built operated with the smallest freedom of movement. It was a contradiction that produced exactly the result Nolan was looking for. Van Hoytema's lighting philosophy for the film stemmed from a principle he has articulated in interviews. The light that exists in the space should be the light the camera records. In the first Earth Act, the illumination comes from windows, from practical lamps. From that diffuse light, rural interiors have where electricity is functional but not abundant. On the Endurance, the lighting comes from instrument panels, emergency lights, from that cold, technical light spaces designed for functionality rather than comfort possess. On the planet's light comes from the strange suns of that distant galaxy. With spectra, Van Hoytema studied in collaboration with Kip Thorne to understand how Gargantua's proximity would modify the quality of solar radiation on each world. Gargantua's visual design deserves specific discussion because it is one of the most significant achievements in the history of scientific cinema. Kip Thorne wrote the equations describing what a rotating black hole of Gargantua's dimensions and characteristics should look like to an observer in its proximity. And those equations were translated by DNEG's visual effects team, led by supervisor Paul Franklin and then supervisor Andy Lockley, into a custom rendering engine. The result was an image no human being had ever seen before, because no human being had ever been close enough to a real black hole to observe it. The accretion disk folded back on itself by extreme gravity, visible simultaneously above and below the event horizon, with colors ranging from orange to white, depending on the temperature of the falling material. Every single frame of Gargantua took approximately 100 hours to render. The DNEG team processed 800 terabytes of data to create the black hole sequences. And here is what few understand about Gargantua's representation in Interstellar. The resulting image was so scientifically accurate it inspired 2 academic papers, published in peer-reviewed physics journals. Kip Thorne and the DNEG team discovered during the rendering process visual phenomena theoretical physics hadn't explicitly predicted. Properties of gravitational optics around rotating black holes that computation revealed before any telescope could confirm them. The sci-fi movie produced real new science. Van Hoytma's visual composition in the space sequences follows a principle he described as the difference between Hoytma's space and real space. Hollywood space is full, with bright stars and colorful nebulas and objects in constant motion. Real space is mostly empty, with details appearing at specific points that, due to their rarity, acquire a more powerful presence than any visual saturation. The shots of the Endurance in space are wide and still, with the small ships set against a vastness that has no comprehensible scale, producing a sense of cosmic loneliness that no amount of accumulated visual effects could generate. The Endurance's emergency docking sequence, where Cooper docks the shuttle to a ship spinning out of control, is the film's technical tour de force from a cinematographic standpoint. Van Hoytema shot the sequence with a mix of handheld cameras inside the modules, external cameras on the Endurance's structure, and DNEG CGI effects, creating a montage where the viewer can follow the physics of what is happening without needing to pause to process the spatial information. It is a sequence Nolan describes as the most technically complex he has ever directed, and the clarity with which Van Hoytema organizes the visual space of that complexity is an achievement in cinematography that industry manuals will study for decades. The anamorphic aspect of the 35mm format produces a characteristic distortion at the edges of the frame, especially noticeable in the night shots of the Earth farm, which adds a subtle, dreamlike quality to the first act. Van Hoytema used it deliberately to create a slight perceptual discomfort in the Earth world, a feeling that something doesn't quite fit, reinforcing the idea that this world is in the process of collapsing even as it still operates on the inertia of what it once was. Hans Zimmer received the call from Christopher Nolan with an instruction that was simultaneously the simplest and the strangest any composer could receive for a movie of this scale. Nolan didn't tell him he was working on an epic sci-fi film about black holes and the end of humanity. He didn't describe deep space sequences or alien planets or gravitational maneuvers around a supermassive black hole. He handed him a single page of text, with no movie title, no genre context, nothing to situate the material in any recognizable cinematic category. On that page was a description of a scene. A father talking to his son about leaving, about the time that is lost, about what it means to leave someone you love with the promise of returning when no promise can be fully guaranteed. Zimmer read the page and composed a piece of music based on that scene alone, without knowing anything else, without knowing the context, working solely from the emotion the text stirred in him as a father, because Zimmer is also a father. And the distance between a father and his children is a theme that doesn't need science fiction to be devastating. When Nolan revealed the complete project to him, Zimmer already had the soundtrack's emotional core. The piece he had composed for the father and son scene became the genetic material for the entire score. The theme that reappears, transformed throughout the movies to hours and 49 minutes, in forms ranging from whispered to tremendous, from intimate to cosmic, but always carrying with it the initial emotional charge of separation and an unfulfillable promise. The Interstellar soundtrack is among all of Zimmer's collaborations with Nolan, which include Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, Inception, and The Dark Knight Rises, the most personal and groundbreaking. Zimmer deliberately decided to step away from the orchestral language that had defined his earlier work with Nolan, that sound of strings and brass and percussion that had created the emotional vocabulary of 2000s action cinema. For Interstellar, he wanted something different. Something that sounded like the interior of a human being contemplating infinity. That wasn't big in the way film music is typically big, but small in a way that made you feel the enormity. The central instrument of the Interstellar soundtrack is the pipe organ. Specifically, the organ at Temple Church in London, a 12th century church built by the Knights Templar, where medieval tombs lie on the floor beneath the feet of the musicians playing. Zimmer recorded the main parts of the soundtrack in that space, with organist Roger Sayer choosing an instrument and an acoustic without precedent in contemporary sci-fi cinema. The pipe organ has a specific quality that no synthesizer can fully replicate when it plays in its lowest registers. It produces frequencies the human body feels before the ear consciously processes them, a physical vibration that penetrates the chest and stomach, generating a physiological response of majesty and slight fear that Zimmer wanted as the film's baseline emotional tone. The main theme of Interstellar, informally known as Cornfield Chase, is also the simplest Zimmer has ever written for Nolan. A piano melody of almost childlike simplicity that appears in the first minutes of the film over the images of the dying Earth and reappears at the most devastating moment of the third act. Its simplicity is functional. A complex melody cannot support the emotional weight this one needs to support without breaking. Simplicity makes it indestructible. You can hear it in the movie's worst moment, and instead of being crushed by the context, it amplifies it. Interstellar's sound design was supervised by Richard King, who won the Oscar for Best Sound Editing for Dunkirk years later, but whose work on this film is equally significant, even if it didn't receive that specific recognition during awards season. The film's sound mix, handled by Greg Landecker and Gary Rizzo, was the subject of controversy upon its release because Nolan specifically requested that the dialogue in some sequences be mixed at a lower volume than conventional, integrated into the sonic texture rather than dominating it. The complaint from some viewers that they couldn't hear certain lines of dialogue was met by Nolan's explanation that this was intentional, that the film's auditory experience should reflect the character's auditory experience in environments where ambient sound competes with the human voice. This decision was divisive but consistent with the film's audiovisual philosophy. In space, the vacuum does not transmit sound, but the ships do vibrate, and those vibrations produce a sonic texture that King designed specifically for each vehicle. The Endurance sounds different from the shuttles, which sound different from the landers, each with its own acoustic signature based on the size, materials, and propulsion system of each vessel. Silence in Interstellar has weight. It is not the absence of sound but a specific presence, a texture King built with layers of low frequencies that the ear registers as silence but the body registers as tension. The sequence of Cooper and Tars separating from the Endurance on the outskirts of Gargantua uses this active silence in a physically disturbing way. At the moment where the viewer would expect a musical explosion, emotionally coding the magnitude of what is happening, Zimmer and King offer an almost silence that forces the viewer to generate their own emotional response instead of following what the music would dictate. The soundtrack's leitmotifs operate more subtly than in most genre film scores. Cooper and Murph's theme is not a melody the viewer can easily hum, but a specific harmonic progression that reappears in different orchestrations throughout the film, recognizable not by its melody but by its emotional color. The space theme, that ascending organ accompanying the moments of greatest cosmic scale, does not contrast with the family theme but grows out of it, as if the universe and the relationship between father and daughter were. In Interstellar, the same thing viewed from different scales. The track Detach, which accompanies the sequence of Cooper and Tar's falling into Gargantua, is probably the soundtrack's most impressive compositional achievement, built on an organ progression that accelerates and thickens to create a sense of absolute imminence, of a point of no return, that perfectly corresponds to what is happening on screen without ever becoming illustrative or redundant. The music doesn't describe the scene. It amplifies it to an emotional frequency the image alone could not reach. Filming for Interstellar began on August 6, 2013. In the province of Alberta, Canada, and from day one set a production tone that crew members later described as unlike any other shoot they had been part of. Christopher Nolan runs his sets with a discipline that his frequent collaborators recognize as one of his most valuable assets and most distinctive traits. He doesn't use video monitors to direct from a comfortable distance while the camera rolls. He places himself physically close to the camera in the space of the set to see what the lens sees from approximately the angle the lens sees it, a practice connecting him to the physical experience of the space he is filming in a way remote monitoring does not allow. His sets are, according to those who have inhabited them, quiet between takes in a way that isn't a tense silence but a concentrated silence. The kind of stillness produced when everyone in a space understands that the work they are doing matters and that distraction carries a real cost. In Alberta, the production set up in several towns in the southern region of the province, including Nantan, Longview, Lethbridge, Fort Macleod, and Oak. The local crew of 130 people worked alongside the 130 core crew members brought in from Los Angeles, and the integration of the two groups was part of the logistical success of the Canadian phase. Nathan Crowley and his team had begun preparing the locations months in advance, building the first act farms with the precision of archaeologists reconstructing a historical period, ensuring every visual element corresponded not to the present but to that degraded future that had the visual texture of the past. The most specific challenge of the Canadian phase was the dust storm sequence, where the Cooper family faces one of the particulate storms that have turned the North American Midwest into a version of the original Dust Bowl, but amplified and permanent. To create the dust clouds, the production's special effects department used large-scale industrial fans to disperse tons of synthetic cellulosic dust across the fields and exterior sets. The synthetic dust was fine enough to create the visual appearance of a real particulate cloud, but safe enough for the actors and crew to operate in without full respiratory protection for short periods. The on-screen resultos: walls of dark material moving across the landscape with a slowness that makes their scale more threatening than if they moved faster. One of the film's most impressive practical achievements. McConaughey described shooting the exterior scenes in Alberta as physically demanding in a way that directly contributed to his performance. The temperature, the dust, the weight of the equipment the actors had to handle in the farm scenes, everything created conditions where the physical discomfort was real and the camera captured it without anyone having to fake it. Nolan deliberately seeks those conditions out when he can create them without putting the crew at risk, because he understands there is a kind of truth in the body of a physically uncomfortable actor that acting cannot fully manufacture. Filming in Iceland lasted 2 weeks and required transporting the entire production infrastructure, including spaceship mock-ups weighing approximately 10,000 pounds, to locations that in some cases were only accessible by unpaved roads that had to be reinforced to support the equipment's weight. The crew grew in Iceland to roughly 350 people, including 130 locals that Nolan and his producers, Emma Thomas and Linda Obst, had committed to hiring as part of the production. Agreements with Icelandic authorities, the Spinnafellskarl Glacier, which served as the surface for Mann's planet, presented logistical challenges the team hadn't fully anticipated in pre-production. Glaciers have a living surface, in constant motion, albeit imperceptible on a daily human scale, with crevasses opening and closing and sections featuring variable, unpredictable load-bearing capacities. The production's safety department worked with Icelandic glaciologists to map the safe zones of the glacier before each shooting day, and the sequence of Cooper falling into a crevasse during his confrontation with Mann was filmed in a real glacier crevasse, adapted for the shoot with safety systems, allowing McConaughey and his stunt double to operate with relative freedom within controlled parameters. The most serious near-miss incident of the entire production occurred in Iceland during the filming of the water sequences for Miller's Planet. Anne Hathaway was wearing a dry suit designed to keep her insulated from the freezing North Atlantic water while shooting the scenes where Brand wades through the planet's shallows. At one point during the shoot, the dry suit wasn't properly sealed and water began to seep in. Hathaway was pulled from the water before the situation turned into a real medical emergency, but she was exposed to the cold long enough to experience the early symptoms of hypothermia. The production's medical team intervened immediately. Filming of those specific sequences was halted for several hours while all safety procedures were reviewed, and Hathaway resumed work the next day with no lasting physical consequences. The emergency endurance docking sequence, filmed primarily in Los Angeles during the 54 days of shooting in that city, was the most technically complex of the entire production from the standpoint of coordination between the physical set and the subsequent digital effects. Nolan shot the sequence with multiple cameras operating simultaneously, some mounted on the physical sets of the interior modules and others on motion control systems, simulating the ship's rotations and accelerations in space. The actors worked on sets physically rotating at controlled speeds while the DNEG team marked the reference points that would allow the physical footage to be integrated with the digital effects in post-production. Paul Franklin, DNEG's visual effects supervisor, described the working process with Nolan as extraordinarily detailed from a scientific standpoint. Nolan and Kip Thorne personally reviewed the renders of the black hole and wormhole, and any element that didn't correspond to Thorne's equations was rejected and redone, even if the alternative visual result might be more spectacular or easier to read for a viewer without scientific training. The insistence on scientific accuracy over conventional visual spectacle produced, in some cases, images that looked different from what the effects team had anticipated, and within those differences lay the discoveries they eventually published as academic papers. One of the most unusual production decisions was keeping the film's working title as Flora's Letter throughout the entire shoot, Flora being the name of one of Nolan and Emma Thomas's daughters. The security measure was effective on exterior sets where casual observers couldn't know they were watching a Nolan production, but it created some logistical confusion. When local vendors and contractors asked about the movie they were supporting, and no one on the crew could give them details without compromising the confidentiality. Nolan maintained around all his projects. The final production budget was $165 million, $10 million less than what Paramount, Warner Brothers, and Legendary Pictures had initially allocated. Nolan delivered the film under budget and on schedule, a discipline rare enough in large-scale filmmaking to be considered part of his professional reputation. Interstellar premiered on November 5, 2014. In the United States, following a premiere at the TCL Chinese Theatre in Los Angeles on October 26, and its box office results told a more complex story than the simple success or failure that industry headlines tended to prefer. The domestic opening weekend grossed $47.5 million, a number that box office Mojo analysts and industry trackers called solid but slightly below the most optimistic expectations for a director of Nolan's stature in his first film following the conclusion of the Batman trilogy. Comparisons to Inception, which had opened to $62.7 million in 2010, immediately circulated in the specialized press as if the gap between the two figures said something definitive about the project's status. What those opening comparisons failed to capture was the nature of Interstellar's legs, that industry term describing how well a movie sustains its box office week after week, beyond the initial momentum of opening. Interstellar had extraordinary legs for a film of its budget and ambition. Its drop from the first to the second weekend was approximately 42%, a significantly better number than the average for blockbusters of the period, which typically drop between 50 and 60% in their second week. This retention indicated something specific about its audience profile, people returning to see it multiple times, actively recommending it, using the film as a topic of conversation for weeks after its release. On social media, the film generated the kind of debates that the algorithms of platforms like Twitter and Reddit favor: open questions about physics, interpretive controversies over the meaning of the tesseract, discussions about whether the resolution was scientifically coherent or a sentimental third-act compromise. Those debates continued for years after the premiere, fueled by every new astronomical discovery that had some connection to the phenomena the film depicted. The contrast between the immediate critical reception and the re-evaluation the film has received over time is one of the most interesting cases in recent genre cinema history. Interstellar reached the 10th anniversary of its release in 2024 with a stronger reputation among critics and cinephiles than it had in 2014. Recognized in retrospect as one of the most important sci-fi films of the first half of the 21st century, a movie that took risks few productions of its scale permit themselves, paying the price for those risks in its immediate reception before time proved they were worth the cost. Interstellar operates simultaneously on three thematic registers that mutually reinforce one another, without ever collapsing into each other, and understanding how those registers work together is key to understanding why the film remains in the cultural conversation a decade after its premiere with a vitality its original box office numbers did not fully predict. The first register is the most obvious and the most susceptible to being misinterpreted: love as a transcendent force. When Dr. Amelia Brand tells Cooper that love might be the only force in the universe that transcends the dimensions of space and time, the line has been repeatedly cited as Nolan's most sentimental moment. The point where the director supposedly abandons scientific rigor for emotional warmth. This reading is superficial. What Nolan is doing with that line is more sophisticated. He is putting into the mouth of a scientist a hypothesis she herself knows she cannot prove, which sounds irrational in the context of her training, but which corresponds to something her experience tells her might be true. It is not the assertion of a truth. It is the articulation of a scientific hunch. Of that intuition, the most important physicists in history have described as the initial impulse preceding equations, The feeling that something is true before being able to prove it, and here is the key to everything. Nolan builds around that speech. The movie proves Brand right. Cooper's love for Murph is literally the mechanism that saves humanity. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but within the internal physics of the film's universe. The beings of the future built the tesseract inside Gargantua specifically so Cooper could use it. And Cooper could use it because the specific relationship between him and Murph was the only one providing the precise communication channel. The quantum data needed to reach someone who could use it. If Cooper had loved his son Tom with the same intensity, but Tom had not been the scientist he was, the mechanism would not have worked. Love is not a metaphor in Interstellar. It is a variable with a quantifiable value in the equation that saves the species. The second thematic register is that of time as an experience dimension, not as an abstract concept. Time dilation in Interstellar is not a special effect or a convenient plot device. It is the philosophical heart of the film. The way Nolan makes visible something physics has spent a century describing with equations, but no human being has been able to live directly. The fact that time is not universal, that it does not pass at the same rate for all observers, that simultaneity is an illusion produced by the velocities and gravitational fields in which we routinely live. Every hour Cooper spends on Miller's planet is 7 years of Murph's life. That equation is not an abstract tragedy. It is the concrete experience of a father returning from a 3-hour mission to discover his daughter has grown. 23 years without him. What few interpreters of the film explicitly name is that Interstellar is also a meditation on the guilt of parents who prioritize work over family, and whether that guilt can be redeemed by the fact that the work truly mattered. Cooper abandons his children for a mission that could save humanity. That mission eventually saves humanity, but Murph grows up anyway without him, carries the same rage of his absence, and reaches old age before she can tell him she forgives him. The question the movie does not answer, and does not pretend to answer, is whether the result justifies the personal cost, whether being the father who saved the world is enough when you weren't the father who was there for the 12th birthday. The third thematic register is that of intergenerational responsibility, the question of what we owe to the generations to come. The film presents 2 answers: Plan A, which attempts to save the living, and Plan B, which abandons the living to ensure the future of the unborn. The revelation that Professor Brand always knew Plan A was impossible is the film's central moral betrayal. More disturbing than Mann's operational betrayal because it comes from someone the viewer has seen as a figure of moral authority, a bona fide scientist who made the decision to lie for reasons he himself considered to be for the collective well-being. Brand decided humanity would better accept the sacrifice of the living if they believed there was a chance to save them, that the lie was necessary for the mission to have enough emotional support to be executed. It is utilitarianism in its most ruthless and simultaneously most understandable form. Interstellar's place in Christopher Nolan's filmography is that of his most personally exposed work. Memento explored the architecture of memory. The Prestige explored obsession and sacrifice. The Dark Knight explored chaos and order. Inception explored the architecture of consciousness. All are intellectually complex films with a certain calculated emotional distance, a structural coldness that is part of his aesthetic signature. Interstellar is the first where Nolan puts his emotional life directly at the center of the material, where the question the movie asks is a question he is asking himself as a father. How much of your time with your kids can you sacrifice for work that matters before the cost is too high? Interstellar's influence on subsequent sci-fi cinema is visible in multiple productions that followed in its wake. Ridley Scott's The Martian in 2015 adopted a similar approach of using scientific rigor as an emotional device. Denis Villeneuve's Arrival in 2016 explored time dilation and the nonlinear perception of time with a clear intellectual debt to Nolan's philosophy, albeit with a completely different aesthetic resolution. James Gray's Ad Astra in 2019 took the space travel structure as a psychological exploration of father and son in ways that would be difficult to imagine without Interstellar as a precedent. The film's scientific legacy also has real substance. The collaboration between Deneg and Kip Thorne to render Gargantua produced 2 academic papers in the journals, Classical and Quantum Gravity, an American Journal of Physics, documenting the optical phenomena discovered during the rendering process. The image of Gargantua circulated in scientific media for years as the most accurate available representation of a rotating black hole. Until, in 2019, the Event Horizon Telescope published the first actual photograph of a black hole, M87, which bore a similarity to Gargantua that the EHT team itself publicly acknowledged. Interstellar is an imperfect film. Its third act asks the viewer for a leap of faith not everyone is willing to make. Some of its expository sequences slow the pacing in moments where the emotional action should accelerate. The adult Tom Cooper character is underdeveloped relative to his dramatic function. But these imperfections exist within a film that attempts something commercial cinema rarely tries, treating science as poetry, time as tragedy, and love as a physical hypothesis waiting to be proven by data. A film that deserves its place in cinema history, not in spite of its contradictions, but precisely through them.